theories and how you can use IR theories in debates. Well, this isn't a session how to approach IR motions in general, but in how IR theory specifically can help you. So obviously there are many more ways in which you can approach IR motions and other things like spec knowledge, which will help you debate these motions better. But oftentimes IR theories and just like knowing the basic assumptions of IR theories can help you approach motions when you don't have the spec knowledge or when you're unsure of like what necessarily this debate is talking about, by building up like basic arguments that these theories talk about. So before I begin, I want to just mention that a lot of the stuff that I've taken for this presentation in terms of the content has been come from like my textbook, which I used in first year of university, which is written by Alan Collins. And obviously the stuff is not mine because I'm not an IR theorist. And so I've taken a lot of stuff from theories, articles, and things like that. And lastly is that I haven't included all IR theories in this. I've included a few broad ones that I think are usually relevant and cover most IR theories in general, and help with IR cases in my experience. And so I will be explaining on like how I will be like mostly focusing on how that helps out or how that works out within debates. Okay, so before like I jump into IR theories, I want to talk about a few concepts because these are incredibly important in understanding IR theories and also just in IR debates in general, right? The first is about power balance in international relations, which is, I don't want to get into the like definitive jargon of it, but power balance basically refers to the structure of the international system that exists between countries, and the way it exists depending on how much power each country has. So certain states have more political and social power than other states do, and that compilation of all these countries creates a balance within the international system that keeps countries afloat. And a lot of IR debates, knowingly or unknowingly, always focus or talk about power balances in terms of like trying to flesh the motion out, whether you're prop or op, and how this power balance looks out within countries. And the power balance that countries have, or the power that a country has generally, I think comes up from three main things. The first is a country's sovereignty, the second is a security, and the third is the economic and social capacity. I'll just be explaining that right now. I also know that this workshop can get a little too wordy because IR theories are just in general like very theoretical and wordy, but once you get the hang of it, it works out. So I will ask you guys to bear with me, but also if you have any questions, just put them in the chat and I'll try to answer them after. If it is something that is pressing, just put that in the chat and I'll just check the chat every like couple of slides, and I'll try to answer that. Okay, so between these three things, sovereignty, security, and economic social capacity, before I like explain with what the jargons entail for IR debates, it is important to note that all these three things are very interrelated and affected by each other. So the capacity of a nation to access its sovereignty also affects its access to security and its economic and social capacity, and vice versa. So it can go in all three directions, and all three things are like important to make sure that a state is like stable, at least in the most fundamental basic ways. So in large, these three things boil down to having autonomy over your state, in a way that you are not influenced or coerced by any other state or any other actor, like say an economic institution or an NGO, in a way that they control the policies that you make, right? So basically, I think in the simplest word, sovereignty is that you have control over your territory and you have control over the country that you are the institute, basically for institutions that maintain the country. So you have a control over this particular place, and you are able to boil out economic, political, developmental policies the way you want to without having any sort of external coercion in an unwanted way. this is important in debates because for states to be able to carry out certain actions, certain political actions, or just carry out whatever the motion is talking about, they need to have access to like sovereignty in a major way. So what that means is that you need to question if the states that are within this debate or within the debate that you're in actually have this sovereignty, right? So in general, before we get into a little more detail, states that might not have sovereignty are like conflicted zones, like Palestine, or other demilitarized zones which don't necessarily have a definite border. So states like towards so the border of Kashmir is undefined, right? It only has a line of control. So those states, that particular area doesn't necessarily have a sovereign controller. And so basically a lot of conflict based sites might not necessarily have 100% sovereignty. But other than that, I've listed Krasner because he argues that states don't actually have a lot of sovereignty. But some IR theorists argue that sovereignty is actually accessible only to states that already have a lot of political and economic capacity. So if you're a political and economically very powerful state, you are likely to be able to access this sovereignty more than a politically weaker state, right? So what this means is the United States is likely to be having a hold over its sovereignty. That is, they are unlikely to be influenced majorly by any other country or coerced by any other country to make a certain action because they have that political capacity, they have that economic capacity. Versus if we take maybe politically less, comparatively lesser uh, politically strong country, for example, Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Egypt, these countries might not necessarily have that leverage of accessing sovereignty in a way where they're not influenced by external influences. Like, for example, they might be dependent on other countries for economic benefits or for social benefits. They might be dependent on other countries for political help or just for security based help and things like that, which means that they are in some way always being influenced into making policies, but also because they don't have enough political capacity, they can also be coerced into making certain policies, right? And this is where like sanctions and a lot of political pressure works in for countries. So you must have seen in the news where like the US puts in sanctions on other countries to make sure that they behave in a way that might be desirable for the US in specific. And that works with the idea that these states then may, and if the states end up behaving in the way that the sanctions intended them to, that possibly talks about the idea that these states probably don't have 100% sovereignty within them. So within debates, it's good to assess that if your state is actually able to carry out a thing that you want to, right? Because you might have ideas as to how a certain conflict that might be spoken about within debates can be solved, but it is important to note which actors are involved in the debate. So if there's a power dynamic where a state is like one of the actors involved is politically more affluent than another state, then it is unlikely that the state with lesser political power has a lot of capacity to make independent changes. And the second thing that sovereignty is related with is just and unjust wars and interventions. So debates that talk about intervening within countries or that talk about the retributive actions of wars and things like that often like hint back to theories that talk about just and unjust wars. I don't want to delve into that a lot because I haven't seen many motions that talk about just or unjust wars, but you should look into it because it's pretty interesting, and which talks about the reasoning or the justification between why countries are allowed to intervene in other countries or into the boundaries of other countries that is violating their sovereignty for moral reasons. Like, for example, if there is a genocide, um, it is morally justified for other countries to step in and stop that genocide. So these things are relevant that come into debates of IR. So sovereignty is singularly very, very important concept. And it is related to security, which means that you have a secure control over the things that you're doing. And security has different models and approaches. Again, I'm not going to, because each of these have like I could take like an hour sessions or for each of these, but there are different models and approaches to security, right? So military, which is a traditional form of security, terrorism, environmental security are both non-traditional forms of security, energy-based security, so that is based on things like nuclear power houses, domestic security, political security, and things like that. And you will see this in debates, right? Because you will see debaters using jargons as how it is important to keep the country secure in a certain way and how certain institutions help them to do that. So if you're talking about economic security, you might likely be talking about, I don't know, the Reserve Bank of India, or like just your general central banks within those countries, but they can also be seen as a security apparatus within countries, and they can also contribute towards security building for nations. And obviously, like I mentioned before, the amount of security or control over security that a country has determines its control over sovereignty. So, if I am a politically or militarily secure state, I am likely to have more autonomy because I know nobody can enter my borders without my permission, or that I can stop somebody who does, in the simplest of words. Okay. The last and the most interesting thing, which I think plays out in almost all IR debates, is your economic and socio-political capacity within a state. I think, firstly, this defines your risk-taking nature, i.e., how likely is a country to take risks in terms of how it's behaving, right? So, in debates, you must have noticed how people talk about how the US has been reckless under the Trump presidency, or how it is or how like it might be not like you might not be sure of what actions the US might take in the future and things like that. What that clearly defines is the capacity that countries have if they have a solid sovereignty, solid economic and socio-political capacity, i.e., if you are not dependent on other countries or other institutions to provide you with this capacity, you are likely to have a hold over your sovereignty and actions. The second thing it does is it defines political action and degree of rationality of actions. And this is linked to like risk taking, obviously. So, how rational you are likely to behave in a certain situation, a certain political situation, depends on how much power you have over yourself and how much power the other actor involved in this debate has over you. So, if you're a country with lesser power than the other country, your risk taking or like the degree of rationality in what kind of actions you will take, um, politically or economically, depends on how much socio-political capacity you have. So if it's a debate that involves like two actors or two states, and if the question so if one state is politically less affluent than the other, that state is likely to act more rationally because they don't want the negative backlash that comes from not complying with what the more politically affluent state wants them to do, right? But there might be other ways that they can deal with it. But basically, your capacity to make rational decisions or to make irrational decisions depends on your economic and social political capacity, and to some degree, what kind of nation you are in. And the last two are it suggests burdens for development and defines capacity to have control over sovereignty. So I think so burdens for development, retribution, etc., like often come out in debates about, say, colonialism or historical past, or about environmental development and things like that, which suggests that countries that have more of a economic and socio-political stability are able to contribute to these causes or causes that are important for the larger good in a way that can be more influensive, that can be more yeah, basically they can influence these causes more than maybe other states that who do not have that economic and socio-political capacity, right? So say in IR debates about or where the debate is discussing the burden of developing states actually contributing to like stop carbon emissions or like the usage of usage of carbon or like fossil fuels. The debate usually goes on in a way which says that developed countries have more of a capacity to actually contribute and make sure that this environmental problem is solved than these developing countries do, because they already don't have the basic infrastructure to work out the basic socio-economic life. And that in terms of retribution, they were late in the whole developmental or like industrial revolution kind of thing. So they should be able to access that kind of development. And then, so basically, that's how it runs out. So countries that have more socio-political capacity can also, you can also determine who has more of a burden within a debate when it's on like, when it's about social development, depending on how much socio-political capacity a state has. These three things also work very well with political debates, specifically the economic and socio-political capacity part. These debates can be used in like political debates as well. Okay, so this is how generally you can approach IR debates. And it looks a little vague right now, but maybe towards the end of the presentation, it will make a little bit more sense. But broadly, I think IR debates can be approached in like two ways. The first is that you need to check about the power dynamic that that exists between the actors that are involved. And you can do that by checking the hard and the soft power that are involved with either. Hard power is basically the military power that the countries might have, and soft power is just like the cultural influences that countries have over each other. And the other way is to check these countries' economic and social, like political capacity. So are these countries doing economically and politically well? Is this a politically unstable state? Is this a democratic state, etc., etc.? And the second way to do that is to check the capacity and incentive for change that the actors in these debates have. So does this state have the capacity to make some sort of change, and does it actually have the incentive to make this change in the first place? And that can be determined sometimes by the type of state in question. So if it is a democratic state, it is easier to prove incentive to drive. It's easier to prove incentive in the sense that it's easier to prove how people can build up incentives within democratic states for certain actions in debates, but it might be harder to prove capacity just because alliances and things like that. Versus in authoritarian states, maybe it is harder to prove incentives for change. That is, in authoritarian states, maybe people want different things, but they're actually not able to communicate that. But the authoritarian states usually do have the capacity for change because they're usually very much based on power and power in the sense military and political power. So these are things that you can try and assess in terms of seeing what incentives these states have for change. And the second way it can be assessed is how it's affected by power structures. I.e., where does this state belong, or where does the state stand in the international structure overall, and how much capacity does it actually have to make the kind of change that this debate might be talking about. And this you can also do by mapping its security status. So is this state politically unstable, or like is the state able to maintain its security? And this can be in different ways, like I mentioned. So you can have different approaches to what you think of in terms of security. And by mapping that security status, you might be able to see how the state is affected by power structures. So just briefly before we start with the first theory, there are three levels of analysis that IR theorists use, and this presentation will be focusing on level 2 and 3. And level 1 is also useful, but more useful in other debates about social movements. Like it focuses on human characteristics and explains events by considering like human nature and by how people are and what ideas people have. But level 2 like the level 2 of analysis is how the states behave within a certain situation. So what are the characteristics of the state, right? Is it more focused on economic development, or is this state known to be more aggressive generally, or is this state known to be very cooperative, etc., etc. And the level 3 of analysis is that you use the characteristics of the system, that is the international system under which states operate, to determine what actions these states will make, right? So the difference between the second and third level of analysis is, and this is also the difference between, not exactly, but very similarly, the difference between realism and liberalism, is that on level 2, you try to map the motives of the states through their characteristics, right? But on level 3, you try to understand how a state is going to make a certain action based on how the international system is. So some people like to take the international system, or try to use this analysis method by just considering the international system as anarchic, which means that there is no higher authority that actually rules all these states. So you don't actually have to submit yourself to someone. So you're not actually accountable in the sense. Um, and some people like doing it by focusing on the balance of power, and some people just like doing it in a scientific way, but we don't have to focus on that for this debate, for this workshop, sorry. Okay, so first theory that I want to focus on, that I think is extremely relevant in debates, is realism. And this is a very important slide, because realism isn't just one theory, it's multiple theories. It's like a family of theories, and they have basic shared assumptions upon which they are building their upon which the different strands of realism build on, right? So there are, I think, 6 basic assumptions that they believe are true in order to understand how states necessarily work. And you will notice that these assumptions are also present in a lot of arguments that debaters make in IR debates without actually explicitly saying so or realizing that these are realist arguments. So the first basic assumption is that the international system is anarchic. So there isn't actually somebody you submit to, which means that states have to just moderate between themselves in a way to make sure that there isn't any occurrence of war. The second assumption is that power as a defining feature of international environment that states face. So realists focus on power, i.e., how much power a state has and how that makes the state behave in a certain way. So realists focus a lot on the actions of state that can be influenced due to power. So how a state behaves depends on whether they have less power or not, and that is the main defining feature of how even other states behave, because they might have relatively lesser or more power than you do. So a lot of, or almost all, problems within the international system that might exist between 2 or more countries can be solved, or is always approached in a way where countries try to solve this power of like this problem of power, or the difference between powers that exists. The third is that it envisions states as unitary actors. And what that means is that they use states as the key actors in IR, which means that they consider them to be the only actor that needs to be discussed in order to predict what actions a state will take in a certain situation. So basically, they ignore all other actors that exist. So all types of NGOs or politicians or activists that exist within a country, or like international organizations, etc., etc., aren't considered important in defining international relations for them. Um, and this also, okay, I'll discuss that in a bit in terms of international organizations and what realists think of those. Um, and the next assumption that they have is that states are rational actors, that they behave in a rational way. And the last is that they're black boxes, which means that all realists consider all states to be the same, but only differing in the amount of power that they have, right? So I think what we can take from that is that. Um, Power is the main focus in terms of deciding how certain things work out, i.e., if you have more power, you're likely able to dictate others to do certain things, or if you have lesser power, you're unlikely to be able to dictate things on your terms unless you have like other forms of power. Or other forms of influences over the other state. And you will see this playing out in debates, right? How people talk about certain states not being able to take certain actions because they just don't have that leverage over the other state or the political leverage over the other state. I think that all plays out within power. And for realists, power entails in all forms. So it can be political power, economic power, cultural power, etc., etc. But power is the key defining criteria. So I think the basic challenges that you can come up with in debates, if you see people making arguments that have their key basis or assumptions within these, are that firstly, you can question if states are the only people that can make change. And these are useful in debates that maybe talk about social movements, but like transnational social movements, or debates that just talk about certain communities or economic institutions within IR debates, because that means that states aren't the only ones that can necessarily take actions. So it depends on state action versus action of other actors, and the persuasiveness and ability of other actors to create change, right? So for example, if this is a debate on passing an environmental policy that helps like environmental change, is the state more able to do this, or are maybe private equity firms or private economic institutions more able to do this because they have a lot of control over how the industries work, right? So you must have seen in debates or must have experienced how people contest that states are unlikely to be able to make environmental change anyway, because they're driven by industries and influenced by industries in a way that they will not actually pass certain laws or will try to scapegoat out of laws that help the environment. So it's better to focus on industries, or it's better to focus on like economic institutions to push for change through them because they are highly influential. So basically, if you see an underlying assumption about states being the key actors in terms of making political change in IR debates, it can always be contested by the ability of other actors to do certain things. Another example is that if there is an IR debate that talks about social development, or that involves things like social development or humanitarian rights or just providing relief and things like that, there might be other resources to achieve that. And the way you can contest it is by talking about other international organizations that exist that can probably provide with relief as well, or maybe relief in a way better than the state can. So I think that on the very basic level, this is how you can approach trying to break the main assumptions of people's arguments in terms of when they think states are the main actors while like trying to enact a policy, or while trying to like just in the debate and in the discussion. While we talk about this, I think it is important to note what the counter of that will be, because a lot of realists, and because that is also something that debaters can focus on if they have a realist base to their case, is that realists don't consider international organizations to be very useful or very influential. Specifically because these international organizations don't actually have the capacity to make large sum change in a way that states can. Because, say, most of these international organizations like the UN or the ICJ or the Criminal Code cannot make changes within these countries, but they can only recommend these countries to do so, right? Because they're advisory based countries. And these are also institutions that can obviously provide with like relief and things like that, but to make actual socio-political solid change, it is incredibly hard for these for these international organizations to actually do anything unless the state consents it to. And a lot of times states don't consent to these international organizations coming in and making changes within their states. So realism focuses on how international organizations are not that effective. And I think that that is also an important argument that you can focus on, or that you can look into when talking about debates that talk about like cooperation in international organizations, right? So you might have seen debates on the World Bank or the IMF in terms of taking developmental funds, or just in general trying to pressurize countries or putting political pressure through international institutions. And a lot of pushback you get through that is the basis of realism's argument towards international organizations, that they are usually or largely ineffective in working. The second key basic assumption that you can always tackle for IR cases is that states are rational actors, because states don't necessarily have to be rational actors. And this is also a critique that comes from critical IR theory, is that rationality for states can depend on multiple things, right? It can depend on the security and political stability of a state. So there are obviously two strands to it, and more things play out in debates and also in real life. So if it is a politically unstable state, there is obviously a possibility that it might act irrationally. But if you're talking about two states dealing with each other and there is a power dynamic, states with lesser power are likely to act more rationally than states with the larger power, just because they don't want to face the economic or socio-political backlash that might come, or the negative consequences that might come from the state with more power. The second reason for states to act rationally, or the second variant that predicts rationality, is the incentive for cooperation. So, if states don't actually have an incentive to cooperate, they're unlikely to actually act rationally, because the moment you act rationally, you are likely to engage in a way that might be preferable to the other side. Um, and so your incentive of cooperation often drives whether states act rationally or not. The third is the predictability of actions from the outside. And this is also a huge part of realism, right? Because, and I will come to this when I'm discussing offensive realism, but is that you don't know what the other side is doing, or there is actually an unpredictability that exists in terms of what people you don't have direct contact with or direct oversight over are doing, which means that you should try to protect yourself or build up power in a way that can save yourself or can help you survive in the best way. So if a state is unable to predict what kind of action comes from the other side, they might not act rationally, in the sense that they might take a rational action that they think is rational, but might not end up being rational. So your rational behavior can also depend on the kind of state that you're interacting with. So for example, if it is very predictable that say if this is a debate about India and China and something about the border war that was currently going on, so if it is completely sure that China will behave in a certain way, then it is likely that India, or like you as a team, can propose rational actions that India could take in terms of just like demilitarizing or whatever. But if you're unsure of what the other side is doing, your argument in terms of making rational decision or suggesting rational policies for actors can be broken down by saying that that unpredictability causes a lot of actors to be irrational or just unstable in the kind of policies that they're taking, because there might be different variants that affect their policies. And the last thing is that rationality for one actor might not be rational for another. I think the classic case is US's invasion of Iraq, where the US thought that it was very much rational to invade them based on their idea of liberal promotion. But there were a lot of people who thought that this wasn't necessarily a rational decision. So if you're able to pinpoint why something might not be rational for an actor that is involved in the debate, you might be able to break down some of the incentives for rational behaviors within the debate that can possibly help your case, or vice versa. I am going to go to structural realism, but I know that there's been a lot of words at this point. So I want to take any questions if there are. I don't think there are any. I can't see any. But if anybody has any questions, would like to clarify something that they don't understand, I will keep a watch of the chat and stop myself when I see something. Okay. Let's talk about structural realism. What does environmental security entail? Okay, that's a good question. So, environmental security can be in multiple ways. A very common environmental security approach is to talk about nuclear power plants and just the environmental security that exists between states. And this is a whole strand, by the way. You can look up stuff and how IR plays out through environmental security. So, for example, the environmental reserves that a lot of countries have can also drive certain political actions from one country towards the other. Uh, and other things like the global commons, which is like the Arctic region, Antarctica, the oceans that aren't controlled by any particular country, are all those are all that come under security, environmental security, because nobody controls them, but there is always a sort of power dynamic that exists in trying to control those areas. So one example would be in the Arctic, that is on the northern side, where there is a clash between the Russian and the US forces in terms of who is able to actually extract resources out from the Arctic in the region. And that is creating a sort of power dynamic in that region. Another example could be overflooding that comes from rising temperatures, or just like the rising of water levels that affects security apparatus in a way that you didn't predict. So if you look into, I can send in certain resources about how there was advocacy for focusing on climate change, because rising waters meant a lot of the security apparatus in the United States was being affected because of that. So environmental security basically just focuses on power dynamics that can emerge because of environmental problems. But other than that, just basic things like climate change, basic environmental problems like rising temperatures, having clean water to drink, fossil fuels, and having just energy to generate power and things like that comes up under environmental security. I hope that was not confusing, clear. Okay, so I don't see any other question, and I will move forward to structural realism then. And structural realism focuses on the structure of the international system. So this is your third level of analysis versus other theories that focus on the state's motives. And these other theories are within realism in and of itself. So you can actually find critiques to certain arguments that debaters might make that might be realist within realist theories. And they focus on how the international structure is to predict how a state would behave in a certain way, right? And I think the basic idea is that there is a never ending struggle among states because there is a new natural human urge to dominate others, right? And the ideal situation is to be as powerful as possible, because at any point, if another state is more powerful than you, either economically or politically or militarily, they have this leverage over you, or they have this indirect control over you that you possibly don't want, right? And there is the security threat that comes from it in terms of just like different strands of security, and you don't want to be in that situation. So I think this theory then focuses on uh, trying to define the actions of states in a way that says that states try to be as powerful as possible just to prevent any sort of negative uh, connotation that just to prevent any negative consequences that come with not being as powerful, right? And you can read Waltz on this, and I can send in more resources, but this is the key line that I thought was important, right? So Waltz says that at a minimum, states seek their own preservation and are socialized to imitate each other, which help to explain recurring international patterns and outcomes. The first line is specifically important, where it says that they seek their own preservation. So many IR debates just focus, like specifically when they're talking like when debates about conflict zones. Um, Talk about how necessarily you need to preserve the basic structure of the state without actually realizing that they do that. So a lot of actions that states might drive, specifically actions by politically weaker states, uh, are dependent on their ability to self-preserve. So they decide policies in a way that can allow them to at least exist in the international system, right? So risk aversion, how do you take the least risky action? And that is how these and that is how this theory plays out. So it is basically predicting the actions of state, and like how states will react to a certain policy, while making sure that they preserve their expectations. And there are other aspects that structural realism consists or like considers, such as geography. So for example, you can see that ASEAN is a just like a geographically political alliance that just helps each other. The same with the European Union, where these countries are geographically close to each other. Um, so continental powers are more likely to be to face balancing coalitions, and this is just basically because countries like to ally with each other to make sure that they have a security apparatus other than themselves to help them secure their territory or sovereignty in general. And states like to like align with each other or form alliances for that very same level, because they like to make sure that they are secure, and oftentimes alliances allow for that to happen. And the second is, this isn't necessarily very important for IR debates, but can be useful if you look into it, is how hegemonic states tend to be like naval powers. So, for example, the Netherlands, the UK, the United States, etc., etc. So basically, that is how structural realism works. It sees that the world exists in anarchy, and because the world exists in anarchy, there isn't somebody you can submit to, which probably means that you need to be as powerful as possible to make sure that you aren't affected in any negative way. So states try to strive and achieve that particular goal. And the next two interesting realism strands are offensive realism versus defensive realism. And these focus on the state's motives to do certain things rather than on the international structure forcing the states to behave in a way. So, offensive realism basically, in very simple words, talks about compiling or putting in resources and power for yourself, because that is the best thing you can probably do to ensure your existence, right? So Mearsheimer said that states face uncertainty about others' intentions, but in addition, that states should assume the worst about these intentions. Because you don't know what these intentions are of the other actor, you should probably assume the worst intentions. You will see these in like this kind of argumentation line forming up the basis of arguments in IR debates, where you can see arguments that talk about how a state should act in caution or should probably act on the air of caution when they're trying to do certain things. Also in social movement debates, when trying to mitigate the harms that come out for certain social movements, there's always a recommendation that these things look at the air of caution, but also assume the worst just in case that the worst actually happens. And the way you can then maybe mitigate that harm is to attempt and maximize the power that you have to the fullest of your capacity. And the interplay of offensive and defensive realism also led to like the arms race that took place. And well, that's not relevant right now, but that is also again something that is pretty interesting to look into. But basically, offensive realism is more at an offensive stage. So it focuses on having the power rather than not having the power or reducing the power. And it also assumes the worst intentions about other states, other actors, everything. Defensive realism is different, that it says that cooperation and restraint are a state's best option, and risks of competition can make cooperation a state's best strategy. So when offensive realism says that there is a risk of competition, Offensive realism focuses on maximizing power because you don't know how this competition is likely to go through. But defensive realism says that because there is a risk of competition, there is a likelihood that the other side might also be willing to comply or might be willing to cooperate, just because you don't want to spend so many resources or just create this kind of a damage that risks of that competition might bring in terms of the risks it entails, right? Which means that defensive realism focuses a lot on cooperation and is much more optimistic than offensive realism is, and also tries to take states on a much more positive level than offensive realism does, right? Which means that it focuses on states uh, and says that states balance against threats and not power. So offensive realism says that the more power a state has, the more power another state is likely to compile, and that is how power structures are going to resemble in the international system. But defensive realism says that states don't balance like that. They balance in a way depending on how much threats they have. So the more you cooperate, the less likelier that there are threats towards your side, which means that there is always an option to like cooperate. So these are like two different strands of realism that also go against how structural realism works. But note that these basic assumptions that exist when like how debaters make arguments within debates can help you build rebuttals that come from either side, right? So if somebody's argument is that a politically unstable state should likely accumulate more power to make sure that it actually is able to stabilize itself and make decisions on its own capacity, um, your rebuttal or your breaking down of that argument could be that the alternative way to approach that is that you have some sort of cooperation and restraint, or that you incentivize methods of cooperation because the other state is also likely to approach in that way because they don't want that damage, and then maybe give analysis on why cooperation is more likely to be feasible than building up power, because building up power can also be seen as very hostile. And the same vice versa, if the team on prop is talking about how cooperation is likely to happen because people just want to avoid war, you can talk about why having more power in different areas, not just militarily, probably helps the state in the long run, because say the state is less politically has less political capacity, so it's always likelier to it's always likely to be influenced or coerced into making decisions that other wanted to. So if the state's focus is on individual agency, then they can focus, or it might be better to focus on building a power that might help them defend themselves in the longer run. So that was obviously basically just an example, but these two strands allow covering up a lot of debates that happen in IR. And I would very, very much encourage you guys to look into these two theories and read papers that these two people write in defense of these two theories, because they consist a lot of analysis that talk about these main points that I've spoken about, which can help you build analysis for arguments that come up in IR theory, like IR debates. And also because it's generally very interesting. Okay, I'm just going to check the chat quickly. I'm moving to the next theory, but if anybody has a specific question, I'm happy to answer that about realism, about anything that might entail realism within debates. Okay, I don't see anything. Okay, how do we defend international organizations against realist arguments? Yeah, so this can definitely be tricky. And the way you can do that also like almost exclusively depends on what the debate is about. But even if international organizations don't have like a solid capacity to make certain change, they do have capacity to make a little bit of change, which can be immediate, versus change that comes from state that might not be as immediate. So in terms of say providing relief or providing like humanitarian aid and things like that, these organizations might be able to capitalize and work on those things better than states do. Um, for example, for communities that the states ignores, right? So, for example, if you are a minority in a country that requires some sort of a relief, you are more likely to get attention from international organizations against in comparison to the state, in comparison to the state that you are in. So, almost exclusively, depending on what this debate is about, I think international organizations can also catalyze some change, right? So, on the superficial level, in terms of getting like international attention for a certain conflict, international organizations can be very, very useful. So, I think you can always flip arguments that say that states are the most important Uh, actors in terms of making changes, to saying that to enable that kind of change in a faster way, you probably need pressure from the international arena that you can get from international organizations. And the second way you can defend international organizations or flip that argument is just talk about how international organizations are incentivized to be effective. I mean, this can be flipped both ways, but just in terms of going against realist arguments, how international organizations have like several incentives to be efficient, because they need to gain that credibility from maybe other countries or other people that might support it or donate money to it and things like that, which means that these organizations are likelier to like act in a more faster and effective way than maybe the states would in a particular debate. If you have a certain motion that you might want to maybe discuss this about, yeah, feel free to put that in the chat, and maybe at the end of this discussion, I'll pull you like I'll discuss that in the very specific context. Okay, I don't see any other questions for realism, so I'm going to go on and explain liberalism and how liberalism works. So liberalism is much more optimistic than realism is, in the sense that it supports a lot or it encourages a lot of interdependence and cooperation between organizations. It also considers states to be the most important actor, but unlike realists, it also highlights the importance of other actors like private economic entities and NGOs. Specifically because liberalism supports private property, free enterprise, economic interdependence between countries, human rights, etc. And these things are often enabled by NGOs and other international organizations, which can prove to be important actors within just like the international arena. And the other thing that liberalism supports is democracy. And I think this is something that you guys might be familiar with in terms of the US trying to expand democracy in other areas that or in other countries that aren't democratic traditionally or haven't been in the past, and things like that. Um, so there are multiple critiques for liberalism. And I think the thing you need to know about liberalism is that a lot of its critique comes out because of the inconsistency that liberalism has in the theories that exist within liberalism. And I haven't put them in because, well, there isn't much you can do with theory and IR theories, and it's particularly annoying that people spend years just studying theory and making sure that they correct certain words. So I haven't put that stuff in. I've put stuff in that I think are relevant to debates within liberalism, right? Because liberalism promotes democracy and interdependence in a way that it enables creation of international organizations, promotes states to promote democracy in other ways, but in a peaceful manner. But there's always been this kind of inconsistency in the way that states actually enact this liberalism. And the first critique for liberalism is that it creates a separate peace. And what that means is that it creates peace amongst those nations that are separately democratic and don't extend the same level of peace to other nations that might not be democratic. And again, I think a significant example is just US and its intervention in like multiple countries and multiple other in multiple like political conflicts. And the separation of peace is linked to democracy promotion, or the promotion of democracy and human rights and other things that liberalism promotes, as a mask for imperial power that is maintained through state and non-state actors. So this entire promotion of democracy and economic interdependence and free market enterprise, etc., etc., the critics of liberalism say is just a way that new imperialism works, or just a different way imperialism has manifested in itself in, because the structures that are created then because of this dependence, economic interdependence, are still very much unbalanced. So some countries have way better economies than other countries do. Some countries also have way more economic leverage than other countries do, but also within these international organizations that exist, right? So, for example, the IMF, they don't have a singular voting system. So, for example, each country has a different percentage share of the vote that they have, which means that countries that are within these international organizations are also very much influensive of the policies that these organizations make. And the critique that comes is that the countries that are more powerful then enable these organizations to work in a way that reinforces this model, which lets these countries be stronger at the very end. And this is how it works, right? So the liberal argument for democracy promotion is that there is liberal pace theory, and that there are sharp distinctions between democracies and autocracies. And because that there is a paradox that exists within an international system, you should be wanting to promote that. And then look at the three main points of what imperialism contains, just in general, is that you either have the justification of desire to change the system. So note that this is very similar to how states might want to promote democracy by intervening in other states without their consent, just because they think that democratic states are better. That is very similar to how imperialists defined imperialism in other countries, that they wanted to change the system because they thought their system was better. The second is that there is the argument for the disregard and lack of consent, i.e., getting into these countries or promoting democracy in a way that might not necessarily be consensual. And lastly, by using the force of threat, even in the form of military intervention. Again, the US is a huge example for this. Um, and this is basically how these two theories might mirror each other, and why there's this argument that the liberal peace theories, the liberal peace theory often mirrors imperialism and the way imperialistic structures worked earlier last century. So, in terms of the clear distinction that exists, is that liberal states are considered to be peaceful, cooperative, have a duty to spread liberal ideas. But I haven't dwelled into very much detail, a detailed explanation of liberalism, specifically because it's a lot of theory. But a huge part of liberalism talks about how democratic states are less likelier to be aggressive, democratic states are less likelier to be violent, and are likelier to want cooperation and want peaceful methods of interdependence. And when everybody in the international system then doesn't exist in a way that then provides a security threat, because you don't know how the other person is going to act, because they're not democratic, so you're unsure of the kind of predictions you want to make about a non-democratic states, which then pushes for powerful democratic states to want to push their agenda onto these states, right? And which is why non-liberal states, because it is we are unable to characterize what they look like, are seen as aggressive, are seen as irrational, and are seen as competitive in comparison to liberal states. And this is an interesting quote, because it says that must have no liberal enemies and no unconditional alliances with non-liberal states. That is a part of the liberal theory, or the theories that come under liberalism, is that if you're a liberal state, you are likely to be friends with other liberal states and other democratic states, but you also cannot have unconditional alliances with non-liberal states, specifically because you don't know what they're going to do, which means that it kind of forces very hard liberal supporters to want to change the international system or the political system of non-liberal states in a way that might be distinctively beneficial to liberal states, just for the promotion of democracy. And I think a counter critique that comes to liberalism in this sense is that a lot of people talk about how liberal states, even within themselves, are not very peaceful, that there are also political conflicts that take place between democratic states in and of itself. And that is another kind of fault that people find within liberalism. And how liberalism functions. This is, you don't have to read this now, but I've put this in the slide in case you guys want to read this. But this is on how consent is disregarded for liberalist ideas in terms of intervening in other countries. That is, there is a right of non intervention. And secondly, in terms of having an ideal liberal domestic regime, uh, for being like the precondition for the constitution of the law of people. And there is a cosmopolitan democratic thesis. I just thought these things were interesting for you guys to put in, but basically I've summed up the broad idea that comes with these ideas, that comes with the liberal idea of like promoting democracy and interdependence through international organizations. So in debates that talk about international development, or that talk about the use of, say, like taking developmental funds from the World Bank, or that talk about just international organizations taking hold of certain things. For example, I think in Astana this year, in Euros, there was a motion on this house would, I think it was moving all water bodies to an international management system. And I think the core argument that people can bring from op side can be based on this basic assumption that cooperation isn't that easy, as a lot of liberal arguments talk about, specifically because there are other reasons for states to behave in a way that might be defensive or might be hostile. Because just because a state is democratic doesn't necessarily mean that these states are going to be peaceful in a way. And those are the large critiques that exist for liberalism. In terms of how this plays out in IR debates, I think liberalism offers a lot of like mechanistic ways in which international organizations can obviously be useful, and how interdependence is useful, just through what the theories is, what the theories within liberalism provide for. But as a counter argument, you can always talk about the inefficiency of these organizations, the inefficiency, or sometimes I think people also talk about how democracies are overrated, and how cooperation doesn't necessarily just entail having certain liberal ideas, but can be countered through other narratives. And then I think in general, between liberalism and realism, there's a lot of back and forth that you can use in debates to make counter arguments if you don't want to use strands of the same theories within those theories. So if there is a realist idea within another state that talks about compiling power, I think a lot of liberal analysis on how interdependence works can be very beneficial in terms of talking about why cooperation is much more likely. And this is also similar to defensive realism that I mentioned before. So I think that these two theories broadly are the ones that interplay between each other a lot in in IR debates, and also a lot in economic debates, um, in just debating. I wanted to quickly cover this because I don't think this is very relevant for IR debates. I think it's more relevant for economics or like finance based debates, maybe. But historical materialism and this particular strand on Marxism, as a lot of people know it, they focus on the analysis. Of class conflict within capitalism. So, the main analysis that comes out of this theory is based on different classes that exist within society and how things change. So I think that this theory and the analysis that you can find within theories of Marxism is very useful for social movement debates or debates on retributive justice. Um, and they talk and sometimes econ and IR rounds, like the combined rounds that talk about econ and IR as well. Because look at the last thing that this slide says. It says that Marxism believes that capitalism is based on insecurity of workers, access to means of production, right? So Marxism focuses a lot on how capitalism is a structure that reinforces structural violence. In a way that reduces access to people who actually want the access or who want to change the way the structure works. Um, and so the people who benefit of capitalism are often ones that are based off of insecurity of workers. So if there's a debate about economic policies that might want to be set across like different countries, or just like economic policy within a country, I think that this model would work in like with helping and building up of some arguments. But I don't think Marxism is very relevant, it is as relevant as realism and liberalism is in IR debates. But I still wanted to cover it because I think that it is important, in the sense that it is also a little bit like post-colonial theory, and I will just get to that in a second. Okay. Now, before I go actually to social constructivism and post-colonialism, I want to see if there are any questions, because I know it's been a lot of words, a lot of jargon, might not necessarily be the best or the most ideal thing. So I'll wait for a couple of seconds to see if there are any questions. If there aren't any, I will begin with this. I will share the PowerPoint, yes. I've made sure that I put in like the main ideas in the PowerPoint so that you guys can access it. And I'll put it on the Discord channel for digital matter files. Okay, I don't see questions, so I'm going to go ahead and talk about social constructivism and post-colonialism really quickly. And so social constructivism is basically an IR theory that bases its construction on the importance of ideas, identity, and interaction. I think that this is a good theory to go through because it can help you in IR debates that might talk specifically about certain communities, because constructivism focuses a lot on how things are perceived and how people perceive things. So like other theories believe that the states exist in an anarchy, social constructivism says that anarchy is itself socially constructed, or that we exist in an anarchy because we want to exist in an anarchy. If we want to make a change, we are likely to make a change. And it says that norms in a society and how the society is built overall, even politically and economically, is because we want it to be that way, right? And I think this is very relevant in like social movement debates and how you can change certain perceptions. But I think social constructivism can be used in arguments within IR debates when you're trying to prove that there might be some incentive to change certain policies or to make certain changes, or there might be an incentive for people to make certain changes. So I think the analysis that comes in terms of how identities and how norms interact with each other can help build your arguments on how activists create incentives for political change within countries, or even if this might be like a cross-national debate. Um, Post-colonialism is very interesting, by the way. I would incentivize you guys to look into it more. Again, more relevant for social movement theories, but also can be relevant for IR theories. And it differs from Marxism in a way because it focuses on inequalities between nations instead of classes. So a lot of the theories or the discussion that comes from post-colonialists often focuses on how the structures that have been left post-colonialism gives or forms the way in which states and other international actors behave. So it doesn't focus specifically on the state in and of itself in a vacuum, but focuses on the prevalence of colonialism that ended up making the power structure of the world that it is today, which is why states behave in certain ways. And that can be linked to states' histories, how states don't like this Eurocentric view that people might have of the global South, or because states might want to be more vocal in general. And they also focus on recognizing the viewpoint of the global South instead of the Eurocentric understanding of these countries. And I think this is also something that you might see in debates, where a lot of debates that take place of the global South happen from Eurocentric views of how problems should be solved, or Eurocentric views of how these states within the global South are, which means that you, as a state from the global South, or as a post-colonialist theorist, advocates for having a diversity of views. But where this helps is in trying to build counter arguments to how certain states behave in the global South, specifically when the debates are about the global countries within the global South. So if there is a debate, or if there is an IR debate on, say, that focuses on certain developmental ideas, or say feminist ideas within the global South, there is probably a different way that people approach these things than people do in Europe. And learning those or understanding those different viewpoints helps in debates that involve interaction of countries with from two different um, not backgrounds, I don't know what the word is, but basically countries that might the countries that were colonized versus countries that weren't, or countries from the global South in general. I see a question. How does neocolonialism differ from post-colonialism? Okay, I don't want to get into that jargon because that can be very confusing, but I will like to answer that question. So I will incentivize you to maybe message me on Discord, because I'll put my PowerPoint there, or on Facebook. But basically, I think neocolonialism focuses a little bit more on cooperation, and a little bit more in an offensive way than post-colonialism does, because post-colonialism can be very theoretical versus neocolonialism. But in the interest of not confusing things, because a lot of smaller strands of theories can confuse people about what theories are. I wouldn't want to discuss that in depth here, but I'm very happy to answer and chat about that in a bit. Okay, I've put in this flowchart. It's not my flowchart. I've gotten it from bookdown.org, which is just a flowchart on what IR theories look like from like a broad perspective. And so if you guys actually want to look into IR theories more, read more things, you can do so by just like looking at this chart and seeing what kind of arguments you are actually looking for, or what kind of analysis you're looking for IR debates, or if there's specific things that you want to look for. So for example, if you want to look for specific things of economic exploitations, or how international institutions work in terms of promoting cooperation, you can probably look at neoliberalism. Or if you want to look at economic exploitation, you can look at post-colonialism or Marxism, and things like that. I think this flowchart is just like a nice overview of what these theories are. I haven't included realism, neoliberalism, neo-post-colonialism, and even feminism within this presentation, specifically because it can be very confusing and can take some time to work on. I haven't even included English school and dependency theory, because both of them are largely constitutive of realism and liberalism and post-colonialism. So they're just specific things that might be theory based, or might not necessarily be as relevant in IR theories. Okay, lastly, I want to discuss the types of motions that come up in IR debates, and how you can use these theories that we discussed strategically within these motions. So the first motion, for the first types of motions, are like actor and policy motions. And I personally think that they're the most usable with mainstream IR theories in terms of using these IR theories to predict states' behavior, right? So for example, you can very really use the realist nature of a state or a liberalist nature of a state within these motions, because they attack a specific actor, or they attack a specific policy that needs to be taken, and it's very easy to then build analysis that comes from it. And I think three important things you need to keep in mind, no matter what the actor is the economic incentive of this actor, that that should play into the debate, the political and security incentive of this actor, and the developmental incentive of this actor. And all of this, again, depends on the hold of sovereignty that these people or that these actors have. But what analysis you can find for these three incentives within the IR theories that I've mentioned before, or which theory is likely to be able to predict more uh, a behavior that is more likely to happen for your side of the house in whichever debate you are, is something that actor and policy motions can benefit a lot from in terms of IR theories. So like a couple of examples are this year's semifinals from Astana Euros is that this house as Israel would form a strategic military alliance with the Kurds in Syria. There is a direct political incentive. Some people can flesh out economic incentives as well, because Israel spends a lot of its money on military. Um, and there is also a developmental incentive, but that is a very low social strand on it. But being able to directly talk about this, or being able to directly strategize which incentive works for your actor, is something that is incredibly important. And the way you can play this out is, so if you're looking towards a realist perspective, you can either go with offensive realism in this and be like, and form an analysis that probably talks about how having a military alliance with the Kurds in Syria is likely to keep Israel powerful, because it will because in a way it lets Israel still hold a lot of power within the region where the Kurds were in Syria. If you want to take a defensive realism or say a liberalist approach, you can probably talk about the benefits that cooperation have, specifically because these are conflict-driven states, and cooperation might be something that will be likely for states to agree on, or will be something that states might want to work on instead of actually building up power and showing hostility. Um, and that was obviously on the very basic level, but as you read more theories in detail, you can find out a lot of analysis that fits in these theories, fits very well within these debates. The second example is this house as the Kremlin would commemorate the 1917 Russian Revolution as a tragedy rather than a triumph for the nation. This can also come under the retributive stand of debates, but as long as you have the actor, you are able to flesh out whether it's an economic incentive or political incentive or developmental incentive. And when you're able to jot that down, you're able to select what theories you want uh, to use in terms of building up your analysis for IR rounds, right? So even if, say, you do not have a lot of spec knowledge on Israel or the Kurds in Syria, I think very basic analysis on why a military alliance is good, or why or how power can be built up for either of the sides, is something that you could just build on during prep time, and then wait for other team to see what other teams run, and then have effective rebuttal against them. So at the very least, you can try and attack structural rebuttal for teams that base off their arguments on certain analysis that might stem from either realist or liberalist theories. Okay. This house believes that motions, and also this house regrets and this house support, are related to discussions on balance of power, i.e., they focus more on the broader outlook rather than the very specific actor that is mentioned in the debate, because these debates should be viewed from a general point of view, which means that a lot of times while trying to explain or build in arguments for why a certain motion should or should not be in action, you can often talk about how it affects the balance of power in a good or bad way within the countries, right? So, for example, again in Athens, this house believes that it is in the interest of Kremlin to take measures to reduce Russian dependency on China. So other than like the obvious arguments that might come out of like spec knowledge or whatever, I think there is a huge scope for talking about how the balance of power changes here, specifically because if you reduce Russian dependency on China, there is a power dynamic that is changing. China is losing a little bit of the power that it currently has, and then you can think of other ways on why necessarily you would want that, or why that would be a good idea, likely. So. I think even if you have like zero, like literally zero spec knowledge on the Kremlin or how Russia is dependent on China, I think the very basic argument that you could run is just about why China shouldn't have a lot of power, and that the Kremlin might probably be able to do that, or to might have an incentive to make sure that Russia is able to reduce this dependency, and then that is a good thing in general. Or that it is just a good thing in general that China doesn't have a lot of power and things like that. And then the second example, again, this house believes that ASEAN should negotiate all investment deals with Chinese governments, with Chinese government entities as a bloc, so that no member state can enter into investment deals without the rest of the bloc. Again, huge scope for power balance or power discussions, i.e., that if so, there are multiple reasons that you wouldn't want these countries to singularly invest with China alone, specifically, but that can come out of spec knowledge. But without spec knowledge, I think the very basic argument that you can make is that China gets more power over these countries. And since they are like smaller countries, they likely shouldn't be doing that, because they might want, it's in their best interest to like have a little bit of control over, or maintain as much as control as possible over their economic and political deals with China. Or the other power dynamic argument that could be made, or that could be the basis of another argument, is that ASEAN negotiating deals with the Chinese government means that a bloc is likelier to be able to make more concessions, is likely to be seen as more important or more persuasive politically, just because they are a huge bloc, and can pursue it in that way, versus just one single country actually getting that investment. And on the counter side, you can then maybe talk about why this shouldn't be the case, because maybe singular countries have different interests and they don't want to get into all singular negotiations with the Chinese government, or that ASEAN, or that like investing within deals within a bloc is a form of restricted sovereignty, that they don't have like sovereignty over the entire over the entirety of the economic investments that they might want to make in whatever, like whichever country you're discussing. So yeah, I think that these arguments can work pretty well if you don't have any spec knowledge, and I think that is a good place to start with, just trying to build up like very basic arguments on how states behave and predicting states behavior depending on their political and social capacity. um, and I think that within then IR debates, this can play out decently if you don't have spec knowledge. And if you have spec knowledge, well, then it's better because you have more analysis. Um, and in terms of IR theories, what I would incentivize you guys to do more, because I know it's boring, it's also really long. Sometimes it's inaccessible because a lot of these things are just like very academic. So might be in university blogs, or like, in university libraries and things like that. Watch YouTube videos. There are tons of YouTube videos on different IR theories. There also tons of videos on how different IR theories explain different geopolitical situations. So, for example, if you just search up realism and the Sino-US relationship, it talks about these videos talk about in great depth of how realism has interpreted the Chinese and American relationship. Um, and the same with other theories, obviously. So YouTube videos is a fun way to maybe do this, because I know a lot of people don't like reading either, and when it comes to IR it becomes even more like boring to do so. The second thing I would incentivize you guys to do is reading op-eds once a week, like starting with once a week. Go to International Relations. Again, I will link that blog while I upload this presentation, and just read one op-ed, no matter what topic. And just read through it. You might understand, you might not understand, but I'm pretty sure you'll understand the basic idea that comes out in terms of how uh, in terms of like what argument this author is making on this blog. And I think that once you're comfortable with understanding those things, start increasing the number of op-eds you read, because a lot of the analysis that you will find in op-eds is also the analysis that debaters make in IR debates, because it's literally the same thing, right? So yeah, I think reading op-eds also like helps build up your thoughts for how analysis can be strengthened in IR debates. And the last interesting way is to look up theorists, and I would incentivize you guys to start with John Mearsheimer, Joseph Nye, and I have a few more that my mind just blanked out. But watch interviews of theorists, um, and how they explain different narratives, and how they're being challenged by other critiques for certain um, developments in status quo international relations, because that also helps you think more about how you can create counter arguments or just build up analysis on how you can break down certain theories or certain base arguments to other theories. So one example is Mearsheimer's realist theory on how China is going to rise is contested by Kishore Mahbubani's theory that China's rise will not be that dramatic, in the sense that it won't be very violent, and it's likelier to be more peaceful. Um, and there's a contestation between them. So there are YouTube interviews where they've gotten both these theorists to come and just like talk about this. And they don't talk for too long. So these are like short, nice videos that you can watch, and probably just listen to in the background when you're, I don't know, maybe cleaning your room. So it's just not very taxing. Yeah, I guess these are the things that you can do. And again, I am very happy to give more resources, direct you towards more in-depth theories or things that you might want to discuss. So please feel free to contact me on Facebook, preferably, because I am very bad at using Discord. But if you message me at Discord, I will at some point respond over there as well. I guess that's it for this session. I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.